Good evening. Welcome everyone to our midweek Bible class. A short time, we'll have announcements and a song in just a moment. There's a sign-up sheet in the back for Monday Night for the Master beginning on February. It'll begin on February 22nd. There's additional information there as well and ways that you can help with that. Very good progress being made on the collections for the outdoor pavilion. There's pledge cards available in the back. If you'd like to make a plan to help with that and support that, if you have questions, you can ask any of the elders and get some more information. A few on our prayer list. The Boland's grandson and daughter-in-law is doing well after the auto accident. The airbag and the trauma with that was some of the toughest things on her, but she's doing well. Brenda Howard, who has visited here a number of times, has asked for prayers. She's going to be seeing a hematologist in Fort Worth. Khalik's aunt is still in the ICU, I understand, and not doing well. Praying for her. Nita Wells, this is sister-in-law of Carol. She's had surgery. She's recovering at home. And Brother Truett Watts, he passed away yesterday. So be praying for his family and all those involved with that. And, of course, remember those who are struggling with this virus. And, of course, we sometimes think about the virus, but there's a lot of other health concerns that people are struggling with as well. So be praying for them. Be praying for the effectiveness of the vaccine that's being used now, and pray for the goodness there. Let's go to our Father in prayer. If you pray with me, please. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for your blessings, and thankful, Father, that we can come together and study your word and be encouraged, and pray, Father, that we can be determined to be a people of yours, and regardless of the situation, the world around us, that will be light shining, that we can make a difference and influence people for eternity. Pray you'll be with us and use us, and pray in all things you'll be glorified. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's turn to number 903. 903. And if it is convenient, let's be standing for this song. 903. We'll sing the first, the third, and the fourth verse. First, the third, and the fourth. Would you be free? Hold on. I started that too high. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil the victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the class.
Good evening. Tonight we're going to be looking at Jesus and the trial he went through with the Sanhedrin, the chief priest, and also when he was handed over to Pilate. Now, I hope you drank your cup of coffee before coming here, because there's a lot of ground to cover and we don't have that much time. So a little of the intro. We learned last week when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was praying to gain strength for what he was about to have to endure. And then he finds all his apostles except one sleeping. And the one that wasn't sleeping was in the process of betraying him, Judas. And then we see at the end of this garden scene where Judas and the mob of people basically to arrest Jesus. And then Daniel, a couple of weeks back, reminds us of what of Peter, how he handled it, trying to cut off, or he did cut off the ear of the soldier. And Jesus rebukes Peter at that time and says, "Put your sword in your place," basically, and those who take the sword will perish by the sword. And before we go into the text, also, I want us to remember that everything Jesus was about to endure, I mean, he did it with absolute courage greater than any man that's ever lived. And at any point in what he was about to endure, he could have changed his course of action. He wasn't a puppet being led. He was in total control the whole time, following God's will. And so I want us to remember that he wasn't under their control. He was in control the whole time, although some looking at it from the outside may think the opposite. And then at the end of Matthew chapter 26, Jesus says, "Why are you coming to seize me? I've been with you in the temple daily teaching, and you haven't arrested me then." And so that brings us, and of course all his disciples flee at that point. And that brings us to the first passage in John 18, starting in verse 12. John 18, starting in verse 12. We'll go ahead and read that. "Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So Annas, we learn, isn't the high priest at this time. So first question when I was reading this, why would they want to go to the house of Annas first if he was not the high priest? So I did a little digging. Secular history tells us Annas was a high priest from 86 to 15, and he was removed by his positions from the Romans for being, what I've read, hard to deal with. But Annas was still, we know, very powerful because 5 of his 6 sons were high priests, along with his son-in-law Caiaphas. So it's believed that he still pulled a lot of strings as far as with the Roman rulers at that time. And he still had a lot of power, even though he wasn't the high priest. In verse 18, John 18, verse 14, it says that it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Let's read a little bit more on that in John 11, John chapter 11, verse 49. It says, "And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Now, this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. And it says, then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. So he prophesied here as being high priest, but in his mind, he was telling the truth, but in his mind, I believe he thought he was wanting to get rid of Jesus for other reasons, right? For selfish reasons. We'll look at a little bit more why later in the class. All right, so we started in John because Matthew doesn't mention this first when the chief priest led him to Annas' house. So we started in John to get that information. Now let's go to Matthew chapter 26. Starting in verse 57. So at this point, we know it was nighttime, and we'll see that later, how we know it's nighttime, but they led Jesus to Annas' house, and after that, they make their way to Caiaphas. Starting in verse 57, it says, and those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last, 2 false witnesses came forward and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said to him, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, it is as you said, nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you've heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? So they're at the home of Caiaphas, and from what I've read everywhere, they're all in agreement that this is all looking pretty shady for the courts of law. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but just an electrical worker, so that's what you're dealing with tonight, and we're going to do our best to look at this a little closer. But remember, this is already planned by Caiaphas and the high priest far in advance, okay? And that tells you that's illegal right off the bat, okay? The court of law, he was guilty before he even entered this scene here. And another thing, this was nighttime. They're not allowed to conduct trials, special or capital punishment during nighttime hours, and we know it's night from what we're going to read here in a little bit. We know there's another trial, an official trial at the Sanhedrin at the break of dawn, and we'll read about that in Luke. So it says in verse 59, they sought false testimony and found none. And this is, I mean, they're trying really hard, right? They want to kill Jesus at this point, and for them to find zero true testimony against him is just a testament to the life he lived, the perfect life he lived. And we know he lived a very public life. He was around multiple thousands of people, and nobody had a single false thing a bad thing to say about him. It says in verse 60 that 2 false witnesses came forward, and they said he claimed to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days. You know how long it took the temple to be built?
40 years.
Like 46 years. So this would be, in their eyes, a joke, right? But was he talking about the physical rebuilding of the temple? No, he was talking about his body and the resurrection. So this would be, in today's terms, looking from their point of view, like a modern-day bomb threat. I'm gonna go up and blow up something, and then I'll rebuild it in a short amount of time. They were thinking physically, not toward the spiritual. So let's go to Mark now, Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 56, and it gives a little more detail on the false witnesses. Mark 14, starting in verse 56. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some arose up and bore false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did their testimony agree. So why did Mark emphasize this, that even their testimony didn't agree? And why did Matthew mention 2 false witnesses? Well, another, somebody have an answer? Okay, well, another reason this was illegal is, one, you can't have false witnesses in the Sanhedrin. That was punishable by death alone. So that in itself was illegal. And looking over the Jewish law, you have to have 2 witnesses, credible witnesses, that have to be separated, basically, and that's what you'd expect. If to have a true evidence come against you, you have to have at least 2 witnesses and have it to where they weren't in cahoots and trying to frame somebody. And that's exactly what they did. They already orchestrated this. This is why Jesus throughout scriptures makes mention of, if you're like the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of God, because their whole focus in life, it was selfish. It was about them. Instead of walking for God, it was walking for themselves. They were never looking for the Messiah in the first place. If they were, then they may have listened to Jesus' defense a little closer. But they were relying on their own works instead of relying on God. They were focused on themselves. So throughout this, we'll go back to Matthew chapter 26. Throughout this, he kept quiet, right? And at this point, if you're a judge and you're asking somebody a question and they're being kept quiet, and you've already brought in false witnesses at this point, how do you think that's making Caiaphas feel? He's probably pretty angry, right? And that's why he says in Matthew 26, verse 63, right after it says, But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And I have an exclamation point after that sentence. So you can imagine he's probably quite frustrated because his trial isn't going as planned. Most people would try to, especially innocent people, are going to try to make a defense for themselves, but Jesus wasn't. He was about doing the Father's will during this whole time. He kept in quiet and complete obedience to God, not calling on any of the thousands of witnesses that could attest to his power. One thing I didn't mention was right after Peter pulls the sword out before they take Jesus, what does Jesus tell him? What does Jesus tell Peter and the people there? Well, he could not have called 12 legions of angels that come in. And a legion, that was the greatest military unit in Rome at the time. It was between, I've read different reports, but they say anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 foot soldiers and around 600 cavalry. It didn't really take that much at all, really. He was just illustrating his point. It only would take one angel to come down from heaven. And we see that, I'll read Isaiah 53, chapter 53, verse 7. Well, Isaiah 53, verse 7 talks about how it says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And so we see that he fulfilled the prophecy there. And also in the Old Testament, in 2 Kings 19, verse 35, that's what I was talking about, where we see an angel coming down and killing 185,000 Assyrians. So it only would take one angel to do the job, but he was just illustrating that he's going to follow through with God's will for him. So verse 65, going back to Matthew 26, what do they accuse him of? What stuck in their eyes? Blasphemy, right? Well, that would be true, except that he was telling the truth, right? So that didn't really stick. But in their eyes, that was enough. That did it. Because right after he says, "It is as you said, nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven," the high priest tore his clothes, saying he had spoken blasphemy. But Jesus was telling the truth, exactly who he was, so that was no crime. And then we see that the soldiers there, the officers, they struck him and ridiculed him. Mark chapter 14, verse 65 says they actually blindfolded him and would strike him, saying, who struck you? And can you imagine hitting the face of God? It's amazing to me the world didn't just end at that very moment, that God had the patience and mercy to see this through all the way. I can't imagine the ridicule he underwent at this time. All right, so this would have been the second meeting, and now they're going to have their official meeting. And if you go to Luke chapter 22, we'll read about the official meeting they had in the morning. Luke 22, starting in verse 66. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." Then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" So he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." To me, this is just comical. They're trying, I think this is their official meeting in the Sanhedrin to try to follow the law, but they're so far from the law, it's funny. I mean, they're so far from following God's will here, and yet they're trying to check off everything to be legal. All right, so at this point, they hand him over to Pilate. Luke chapter 23, starting verse 1. It says, "Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this fellow perverting the nation by forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king.' Then Pilate asked him, saying, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' He answered him and said, 'It is as you say.' So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, 'I find no fault in this man.' But they were the more fierce, saying, 'He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place.'" So this is this account. We see that he faces Pilate twice. Now Matthew's account, he condenses it to where we just see Jesus meeting with Pilate the second time after he comes back from seeing Herod. So they led him to Pilate. Now, who was Pilate? Pilate was the Roman governor in charge of Judea. And he was in charge of keeping the peace, right? Rome at this time was conquering a lot of area. So you have Pilate in charge of Judea, and then Herod Antipas, who was over Galilee. And now they both were in the area at the time for the Passover, probably to keep from public happening, uprising or something. There's to be so many people at that time coming into the city. So why did the chief priests, notice they changed they first accused him in their Sanhedrin of being a blasphemer, right? And here, what do they accuse him of to Pilate?
Insurrection.
Yeah. So why would they change their mind here about?
Well, they knew that if they went up there and he talked about blaspheming God, the Romans could really care less. But if you make it personal and say that he offended Caesar, well, then that's a different story.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what. Did you have something? Yeah, she's saying overtake the government, and Rome would never allow that. So that's exactly right. They knew, they're smart. They knew Pilate's not going to go for that. So they're trying to convince Pilate that he is a threat to Rome. That's their main agenda here. So why do you think Pilate here saw right through him? I mean, he said, I find no fault in this man. I think it's because and they say he's king of the Jews. Oh, really? He's king of the Jews and he's in here bloody and torn up and beaten? No, I don't think so. He's not even, if you have a guilty man, especially innocent man, they're going to be frantically trying to defend themselves. Pilate, through secular, if you read about him, he was wrote about as being cruel. Okay, killing was what they were good at. They knew how to kill, and there's a lot of bloodshed, and they were used to seeing it. So if somebody was in front of Pilate, he literally had made the decision to live or die. Okay, and Jesus was quiet this time. That's why, if you read in Matthew, he said Pilate marveled over, because, I mean, how many people had Pilate seen at that point? Had executed, and probably did anything they could think of to get out of it. And here Jesus is quiet, and so he's probably never seen that before, ever. And Pilate knew he was an innocent man, a just man, and he didn't want to have that on him, right? So let's keep reading. Now we're going to go to Luke 23, starting in verse 6. And this is the trial before Herod, and he wants to get rid of him. He finds he's from Galilee, right? And so I'm gonna send him to Herod, especially Herod's in the same city at this time. It says, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he had hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. So it says Herod, this is Herod Antipas, and we read about Herod another time, the main time being when he beheaded John the Baptist. And right after that, we see, he hears of Jesus' miracles throughout the land, right? And he thinks, what does he think? He thinks that's John the Baptist resurrected. So from that point on, he caught Herod's attention. And we see here, the only reason Herod was eager to see him was to see a miracle. That was it. And we see that because he didn't perform a miracle for him. And then when he questioned him and he answered him nothing, he had his soldiers beat him more. So Herod just wanted to see him for entertainment purposes only. It says at the end there, Herod and Pilate became friends. I guess Jesus was the only thing they had in common at that time. The opposition to Jesus was the only thing they had going for themselves, so they became friends. Those are pretty cruel people, aren't they? All right, let's go back now. We're going to read about the second trial. So after Herod doesn't want anything to do with him, so he sends him back to Pilate. And this is the second trial before Pilate. Let's go to Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." So we'll finish it out, but we'll stop right there a second. So there was no possibility for a fair trial for Jesus. And Pilate, during this whole time, his conscience told him, get rid of Jesus, send him away, give him Barabbas. Even his wife at this point had a dream, Pilate's wife, and she said she suffered much because of a dream about Jesus. Now, I imagine her, she's waking up, she has this dream. Have you ever had a dream probably that you wake up and you're glad it was just a dream, right? Well, she woke up, and it was too real just to be a dream. She knew this was not just an ordinary dream. And I imagine she finds, either she hears news from Pilate himself, or finds out from somebody else, a servant, that he's in a trial with a man named Jesus from Galilee. And this probably just sends chills down her body, right? I mean, she suffered because of a dream she just had about an innocent man. And now she finds out that Pilate's in a trial with Jesus, the man in her dream. So she sends him a message saying, have nothing to do with him. I don't know what she saw. We can just contemplate what she saw in her dream. Who knows? But she could have seen her in the judgment, or Jesus coming down in the clouds at the end of time. Who knows what she could have seen? But it's interesting to think about what she saw in that dream. So Pilate hopes to release Jesus. And so if both Pilate wanted to release him and he had encouragement from his wife to have nothing to do with him, why did Pilate still go through with it? Hold on, Danny. We got a good message here.
Got to sit up straight. Because there was a riot. He was afraid that a riot was going to start. With all their shouting and everything, saying "Crucify him, crucify him." He was afraid of an insurrection, so he did it to kind of appease them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because if you're Pilate at that time, Caesar is obviously in control, and so if you let the crowd get out of hand, cause turmoil, that's going to come back on Pilate. And he didn't want. If he has a choice to save himself or kill Jesus, he's going to choose him to save himself. So that's what he did. So we answered the question about Pilate, why he wanted why he chose to do what he did. But what about the chief priests and the members of the Sanhedrins? What was their? Why do they want to kill Jesus so bad?
They want to keep
The status quo. Was that it? I think that's a big part of it. Let's go back. I think it's John 11. Let's see. It talks about Caiaphas and that he talks about one man would have to die for the multitude. Let's see. Yeah, John chapter 11, starting in verse 45, says, Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. We see there too, also there's a little bit of fear of the power Jesus was gaining. I think you're right. The more Jesus became powerful in their eyes, the less important they were. And they were more concerned about themselves, right? They weren't looking forward to a Messiah, and that's why they missed him. But they were worried also about Jesus having all these followers, because it says there that the Rome would come and their whole nation would perish. So they're worried about that too.
So Rome was like in charge, but they let them retain a lot of their own stuff.
Right. So I read a lot about why this was not a fair trial. We talked about they had the first trial at night. That was illegal. And then also they should have looked for witnesses before the trial started. And then of course, what do you see? They find the witnesses after it started. And not only did they find witnesses after the trial started, but all they had was false witnesses. And then we talked about the false witnesses should have been punished. That's against the law in itself. And then the leaders of the Sanhedrin orchestrated this. And then they never considered Jesus' testimony in the first place. Jesus gave a true answer, and they never stopped. They had so much hate in their hearts already, they never stopped to ask, well, is he telling the truth?
You
Go
know,
ahead.
they actually have two different charges against him. You know, so the charges weren't even consistent. So when you go to court, you know, say, well, you know, we're going to get and charge Paul with, you know, selling whatever, you know. Well, actually, my original charge was this, but we're going to go ahead and do this. You know, so they actually changed the charges on him too, you know, on two different court hearings.
That's true, yep. Well, let's finish out reading to see what happens in Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 23. Then Pilate, the governor, said, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So it's interesting, verse 25, it says, "His blood be on us and all our children." And not in the same reason they said it, but Jesus' blood would be on all of them and everybody in the nation. So, is there any other comments? Thank you all. Next week, Daniel's going to talk about, what are you going to talk about? Crucifixion. And then the next week, resurrection.